Hello again, Adam here. If you like the content I'm putting up, please like, comment, and subscribe. Alright, let's begin. Turkey recently converted the Hagia Sophia Museum into a mosque. So I just wanted to give a little background information and some thoughts on this to clarify things for people who might be interested in what's going on and what it means. So for a little historical background information, the Church of the Hagia Sophia was built in 537 CE by Emperor Justinian I, and the Turks also call it Hagia Sophia, which means holy wisdom. In 1453, the Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople after a 53-day siege. The city was all that was left at the time of the Great Byzantine Empire. So at this point, the empire had been reduced to just Constantinople and the surrounding areas. Even though Constantinople was in decline, the Byzantine Empire was in decline, this was the death knell. This was the final end of the empire. Now, after the city was conquered, Sultan Mehmed II converted the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. I want to point out that this is not strange or unprecedented. This is literally the standard operating procedure when Muslim areas were conquered by Russians or by Spanish Catholics during the Reconquista. They would convert their mosques into churches, or they would just destroy them outright. So this is not strange. This is not violating any protocol at the time. What was strange, however, is while the city was being sacked, the Sultan gave orders that no one who was in a religious building, no one who was in a church or a monastery should be attacked. And certain Christians came to him while the city was being sacked and asked him for his personal protection. And what he did is he sent his personal guards to these churches to protect them. And then after the conquest was completed, most of these religious institutions were kept intact. And the Eastern Orthodox Christianity and the Armenian Church were all actually supported by the Ottomans. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque where they added minarets, and for the next 500 years, Muslims prayed in it as though it was a mosque. In 1934, it was turned into a museum due to some regional politics regarding the Balkan Pact. The claim is that Ataturk did this because it was part of a program to secularize the country, and while no doubt he was trying to secularize Turkey, that's not why he did this, because it doesn't really make sense for him to do that, because it's the only mosque that he turned into a museum. Yes, there were some religious restrictions, but this really wasn't one of them. So that was a little bit of the background information. I wanted to continue on and talk a little bit about the framing of this issue. So as we said, for 500 years, this was a place of worship for Muslims. When the mosque was converted to a museum, what essentially was happening is the state was banning Muslims worshiping in that area. This was an imposition by the state against the worshipers in the mosque. This transition from a museum back to a mosque is actually removing an imposition. While it was a museum, Muslims and Christians were not able to pray. So converting it back into a mosque does not restrict the rights of Christians. Rather, what's happening is the rights of Muslim worshipers are being restored. I'd also like to point out that the very idea of converting a mosque into a museum is completely unprecedented in history. This is just something that did not happen. There are mosques that function as tourist attractions. So some of them have been built as tourist attractions, and there are some very impressive mosques out there around the world that are used for Muslim worship, of course, and are also really big tourist attractions. And there are also some historical mosques where Muslims do in fact still pray, and they are used as tourist attractions where Muslims and non-Muslims can freely visit those mosques, so long as they respect the general Islamic nature of those areas. So you could argue, as a different argument, you can argue whether or not the Hagia Sophia is better as a museum or a mosque. However, I think those worshippers whose rights were infringed upon early on would pretty clearly say that it is better as a mosque. So you can frame this as righting a wrong rather than an imposition on a religious minority, which is a kind of what the framing of this is going towards. The other part of this framing is this a unique case? Are the Turks uniquely violating any rights or international norms by converting a museum back into a mosque? The truth of the matter, to my knowledge, is there is no former mosque that's been converted into a church that has been further converted into a museum where Christians are banned from praying there. This is just something that I haven't seen anywhere else in the world. Yes, there are churches that are open as tourist attractions, but Christian worship is not banned in those churches. And there is no international outcry to convert these back into mosques or into museums for the sake of international solidarity or interfaith dialogue. It really seems that this issue represents something of a double standard. And again, this issue is being framed as an imposition or restriction on religious minorities, or that it could create a climate where religious minorities are offended or potentially persecuted. And this just doesn't seem to be the case. There's no evidence for it. The Christian population of Turkey right now is between 0.2 and 0.4%. And none of their religious houses of worship, none of their churches are being affected. That is just not even in the conversation at all. Again, the framing for this should be seen as what it is. It is the removal of restrictions from the Muslim worshippers who want to worship in the mosque, and really righting this unprecedented wrong of converting a mosque into a museum. So I wanted to transition to some of the responses and reactions of different people around the world and different groups, Muslims and non-Muslims, for and against. One quote here I have is from Garo Paylan, who is an Armenian member of Turkey's parliament. And he tweeted out that it was, quote unquote, a sad day for Christians and for all who believe in a pluralist Turkey. The decision to convert the Hagia Sophia into a mosque will make life more difficult for Christians here and for Muslims in Europe. He wrote, quote unquote, the Hagia Sophia was a symbol of our rich history. Its dome was big enough for all. Now, it's this issue of Muslims in Europe having a difficult time. Now, I'm going to go over that in a moment. But first, I wanted to point to a situation which is analogous to this situation. In the early 2000s, Spanish Muslims lobbied the Catholic Church to allow them to pray in the Cathedral of Cordoba, which is formerly a Muslim mosque. The Muslim prayer is often stopped by guards. Now, my wife personally went to visit this mosque, and when she was seen wearing the hijab, security guards actually followed her around and told her kind of aggressively, there's no prayer around here. There's no prayer allowed here. And they followed her and her friends to make sure that they didn't, in fact, pray there. So they're pretty aggressively preventing Muslims from praying there. So is this an imposition on the religious freedom of Muslims for them to be prevented from praying in what is currently a Christian church? I don't think that's crazy. And it would be nice, perhaps, but it is well within the rights of those Christians who run the church to refuse other religions from praying there. It's still open for tourists, however, the Vatican has a position, and they do not want Muslims praying in that church. Moving on, here is a tweet by Dr. Jonathan Brown, who says, maybe the Turkish government should maintain Hagia Sophia as a museum if Belgium allows girls to wear hijabs in school, or if Macron stops talking about Muslims in the Balkans as a quote-unquote jihad problem. So Dr. Jonathan Brown brings up this important point, and the issues of this decision possibly making life for Muslims in Europe difficult is not that accurate, because life for Muslim, or religious life for Muslims in parts of Europe, is already difficult. And there are impingements on the religious liberties of Muslims. These are actual impingements on the religious practice and identity of Muslims in Europe, including France, including Switzerland, including many parts of Europe. And what's problematic is that these are not seen as things that will violate the relationship between Christians and Muslims. It is this quote-unquote symbolic gesture, and quite honestly, This is a symbolic gesture because the only thing that this is doing at this point is it is allowing Muslims to conduct prayers in what was formerly a museum. It is not impinging on rights. What it is removing an impingement. If you wanted to argue that the result of making this into a mosque will be the destruction of the historical legacy of this museum or this church, and that some of the frescoes will be destroyed, some of the Christian iconography will be destroyed, well, then that is a different question, and there's no evidence that that's what's going to happen. Moving on to another part of this thread, someone responds and says, this is problematic in two aspects. One, the issues are unconnected. And two, it makes us European Muslims responsible for foreign issues. Dr. Jonathan Brown responds and he says, Salam, I think they are connected. This is really about the quote unquote true identity of Europe and how it can't be Islamic. It can be secular, read secular Christian, or Christian. For number two, I think it makes Muslims everywhere responsible for Muslims' problems, which is good. And I guess the idea is that he wants there to be some sort of quid pro quo. So if Christians want more access to this mosque, then they would have to make concessions in other parts of Europe to allow for more religious liberty of Muslims who are living there and for restrictions to be removed. So this is one perspective, and I think it has some merits, so I wanted to put it out there. Next, I want to talk about some Muslim reactions where they don't agree with this decision and kind of respond to them. The first one I'm going to bring up is hilarious, and I'm not taking it seriously. I'll just read the headline. Egypt's top fatwa authority raises controversy after describing Ottoman control of Constantinople as quote-unquote occupation. So the background for this is that this top fatwa authority actually had a fatwa against this transition from a museum to a mosque. And to give you an idea of how they feel about the Turks in general and Erdogan in general, is that they called the Ottoman control of Constantinople as an occupation, which is like bonkers and bizarre because you could just throw this right back at Egypt and say that Egypt is occupying formerly Christian lands. It's ridiculous. And really the background or the subtext of this is there are geopolitical problems and conflicts between Egypt and Turkey and ideological problems between Egypt and Turkey. And these are being reflected in this quote unquote fatwa. So I don't really want to take this seriously, but I did want to put it out there and show it that some of the reactions, especially the ones that are more political or with people with political affiliations, some of these reactions are really based on politics and geopolitics and ideological differences. So I just wanted to put that out there so that people are aware of it. Next, I want to talk about Dr. Saeed, president of ISNA, which is the Islamic Society of North America. He has a statement which I think is a little problematic. He appeals in this message to the historical examples set by the righteous caliphs. He says, as Muslim Americans, we celebrate this Islamic provision in U.S. law that enables us to build 3,000 mosques in the last half century. Hagia Sophia is not just a church, but the main symbol of the Greek Orthodox Church. It is a slap on the entire system of the Greek Orthodox Church and Greece. It fostered permanent hate against Muslims and Islam in these quarters. Dr. Saeed further adds the destruction of the Babri Mosque in India is a historical example of religious bigotry. We cannot do the same thing to the Hagia Sophia. I find this statement a little problematic. First off, I think there's a false equivalence between the United States allowing Muslims to build mosques in the US because as far as I know, there are no bans against Christians building churches in Turkey. So it's kind of a false equivalence. Furthermore, equating this transition from a museum to a mosque, where really all that's happening is that the imposition that Muslims will not be allowed to pray in the Hagia Sophia, I do not think that this equates to the destruction of the Babri Mosque in India. Like, Muslims are not destroying the Hagia Sophia. Now, if it comes out that they are destroying the Christian iconography in the mosque, that's a different story. And as of right now, there's no evidence for that. So I really am uncomfortable with this equivalence that this is the destruction of the Hagia Sophia. Dr. Saeed goes on to say that the destruction of the Babri Mosque is like having the Hagia Sophia converted into a mosque. The truth of the matter is that the Hagia Sophia is not being converted into a mosque. It is being reverted back to a mosque from being a museum. Prior to it being a museum, it was a mosque. It was not a place of worship for Christians for 500 years prior to that. So I don't think that it is equivalent. At the same time, there is no indication. As a matter of fact, Erdogan has gone out and said that it will continue to be a tourist destination. So any Christians who would like to visit it will be able to visit it, and they can benefit from any attachments that they have or any symbolism that they appreciate and is part of their religious tradition. Again, he ends with this idea that it's the Islamic tradition to preserve places of worship for religious minorities. And that's in the same vein as this next quote, where it says, Hazrat Omar, the second caliph of Islam, set a great example. After conquering Jerusalem, he was offered to pray in the Holy Sepulchre. He chose not to pray inside the church for the concern that the future generations of Muslims would convert it into a mosque. This is all true. The context that's missing, though, is that when Jerusalem was captured, the city surrendered and signed a treaty with the Muslims. And that treaty gave them protection. That was not the case when Muslims conquered Constantinople. Constantinople was under siege for almost 2 months. When cities resist, they don't have the same protections as when they surrender and sign treaties. Now, I don't want this to sound like it is a uniquely Muslim thing. This is actually just what happens in pre-modern warfare. This is a pattern that was repeated with Russian conquest of Muslim land, Spanish conquest of Muslim land. Just historically speaking, if you resist, you lose some of those protections. For an example of an analogous situation, when the Spanish were sieging Granada, the last Muslim holdout in the Iberian Peninsula, the Muslims decided to surrender and write up a treaty, and the treaty is called the Treaty of Granada. One of the stipulations in that treaty was that none of the Muslim houses of worship, none of the mosques would be molested or converted or destroyed, and this was agreed upon by the Spanish. And if you look now, none of those mosques have survived. They do have mosques there, but those are all very recent in the modern era. So you can see that this is just the MO of war in the pre-modern period. So I don't really think that these discussions saying that it should never have been converted to a mosque in the first place are really historically honest. Just to be clear, I am not making the case that in the modern day we should convert Christian or Jewish or any houses of worship of one religion to the other. This is not the argument I'm making. All I'm saying is that the original conversion in the 1453 of this church into a mosque was just how things were done back in the day. It was done by Christians and Muslims and anyone else. However, now this is not really even the equivalent issue. It is conflating these issues because the church was a mosque for 500 years and then became a museum, and this is just converting a museum back into a mosque. So again, this is not infringing on the religious liberties of any religious minorities, and that's the major point. This brings me to this comment here, which goes, it should never have been turned into a mosque to begin with. The Prophet forbade it. Give it back to the Christians. Again, this is really conflating these two issues, which I talked about. It's out of context. But then there's this response, and it says, Amin, you're right. It is the moral thing to do. We shouldn't take over other people's places of worship. Or rather, I should say, we should not take other people's worship spaces. Historically, we often have. I really think this is a dishonest reading of history. And, if you open up this door, then how is it going to work? How far back are you going to go? Are Muslims going to reclaim the churches that have been converted to mosques in Spain and Russia? Like, how far does this go? It's really, I feel like it's a really dishonest reading for history and a real reach, and it's not helpful for anyone. And you'll see when I go through some of the Christian responses that I think many Christians are of the same mind. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about this issue of the World Heritage Site. So here is a quote that was tweeted out by Sam Brownback, and it says, "The Hagia Sophia holds enormous spiritual and cultural significance to billions of believers of different faiths around the world. We call on the government of Turkey to maintain it as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. in its current status as a museum. So I looked up UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and I saw a number of them were religious places of worship. So there were churches. There is no reason why this shouldn't remain a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I don't really think that this is a real issue. It's more rhetoric than substance, in my opinion. Now let's turn to some Christian responses. And the first one I want to talk about is the tweet from the president of Greece. She says, "The decision of the Turkish leadership to turn the Hagia Sophia into a mosque is a profoundly provocative act against the international community. It brutally insults historic memory, undermines the values of tolerance, and poisons Turkey's relations with the entire civilized world." Now, there's an element of racism in this, but I don't want to get into that. The general point is that this is very strong language, and this language would resonate more strongly if people who held these opinions and views were just as vocal when the actual religious practice of Muslims that is banned in certain Western European countries, if this was addressed by these people, then I would say that they have some sort of credibility. Unfortunately, I did not hear these same outcries when things like, for example, minarets were being banned in Switzerland, when this hijab issue where Muslim girls are prevented from wearing the hijab in schools. When you have these issues in the West, like the burkini in France was a big national issue for several weeks and it's actually banned. The niqab or the face covering is banned. And it's really these impositions on Muslim practice, Muslim identity, Muslim freedom, that if these individuals were coming out strongly against this, that we could take it more seriously. But as it stands, this decision to revert a mosque, a museum back into a mosque does not impose any restrictions on the religious practice of Christian minorities in Turkey, full stop. It just is not happening. So I find these strong proclamations and denunciations a little hypocritical. Now, here's an interesting quote. This is the position that Catholic bishops in Turkey are taking. Quote, "We are a church deprived of juridical status, so we cannot give any advice on this country's internal questions," the Turkish Bishops' Conference said in a statement to Catholic News Service. A lot of people have criticized the Catholics, including the Pope, for not making a strong statement on this. And I believe the reason they're not is because they are fully aware of the reality of Muslim demands of Spanish Catholic churches that were formerly mosques in Spain. They are aware of these issues, they are aware of these demands, and if they were to make a statement here, then they would be opening themselves up for a precedent for them to allow Muslims to pray in Catholic churches in Spain. Now, I don't think that they are blameworthy for trying to prevent other religions from having religious access to their sites. So imagine going and praying the Friday prayer and having 500 or 1,000 Muslims showing up to a Catholic church to pray. They are not crazy about that, and so they are, I would say, wisely remaining quiet about this issue of returning it from a museum to a mosque. This next quote is also very important because it comes from a religious minority that lives in Turkey. So the Armenian Patriarch is quoted as saying, "I believe that believers praying suits better the spirit of the temple than curious tourists running around to take pictures. The site is large enough to allocate a space for Christians so that the world can applaud our religious peace and maturity." And I think this is a really important point to set some sort of basis for the future moving on. So I want to transition into ideas for the future. What can we do in the future? What does it look like? Where does it look like this is going? And to set some Islamic precedent, I wanted to recount this episode in the life of the Prophet Muhammad. He once received a delegation of Christians who came from Najran, which is a city in Yemen. And 60 Christians came to the Prophet's mosque in Medina. And when it came time for them to pray, he allowed them to pray. They turned towards the east, inside of the mosque. They turned towards the east and prayed. The Prophet's mosque is considered the second holiest site in Islam. The Hagia Sophia doesn't even compare. So this is a promising basis for the future. As for Christians, in 1931, the Muslim philosopher and poet Muhammad Iqbal asked the Spanish authorities if he could make the call to prayer and pray in the great cathedral of Cordoba, and he was allowed to do so. So there are these points of interfaith solidarity And there is a way to move forward from this without having really aggressive rhetoric, without trying to conjure up a clash of civilizations kind of narrative, without trying to scare people with the thought of having religious minorities discriminated against. This doesn't really need to be this way, and it should be seen as something that is truly a removal of an imposition on Muslims from praying there, and just honestly, just a symbolic gesture, even if, some people are claiming that Erdogan is doing this for cynical political reasons. The very reason that it became a museum in the first place was for political reasons. So I don't think that this should be turned into an opportunity for conflict, and rather an opportunity for cooperation. Well, thanks for listening. If you enjoy the content, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you again next time.